taking care of children, right? That $2 to $1.25 that they survive on, right, is largely the responsibility, largely in many of these nation states, is assumed by women, right? So again, these percentage breakdowns of what we see up here and what the percentages are: 15% high-income countries are about 15% of the global population. Right? So where is the majority? Obviously in the middle. More than 70% of the world's population lives in middle-income countries, the lower and upper middle categories combined. Right? Again, these countries here, Soviet states like Armenia, Belarus, South and Central American states like Brazil and Belize, Middle Eastern countries like Lebanon and Iran, and similarly to what we saw in Venezuela right now, in South American countries, in Brazil, there's upheavals because the current president, Bolsonaro, has a pro-development agenda, which many environmentalists in protecting the rainforests in Brazil are protesting currently. So, political unrest. The World Conference on Climate Change in December, the end of November, the beginning of December, initially scheduled for Santiago, Chile, has been moved to Madrid, Spain, due to political unrest, economic unrest in the country of Chile. Right? There's almost civil war right now in the country of Bolivia. Right? So when we look at these South American countries, right, the majority being low, middle, or lower income, right, with maybe certain exceptions of the Brazilian economy. Right? Chile seems to be sitting, fairly well. Parts of Argentina, but the majority, right? It's not like these people are fleeing these countries out of choice. They're fleeing these countries out of survival. Right? So again, like high-income countries, low-income countries constitute a relatively small proportion of the global total. Again, like I said, many are in a situation of agricultural-based economy, rapidly growing populations, the growing phenomenon of urbanization and industrialization. So, other tables, again, when we look at other variables that emphasize stratification, right, or divisions in society. The UN in 2015 estimates that 795 million people are chronically undernourished, and over 90 million children under age 5 are dangerously underweight. At the turn of the millennium, as one of these goals, the United Nations set a goal of substantial reduction of hunger around the globe. And we know, as a nation state, we have been very responsive to these nation states in time of need. Right? We have a tradition, a history, right, of being, of helping other less privileged economies and nation states throughout the world. By one estimate, over 270,000 as a result of military conflicts have been killed in war in Syria. And again, this is dated statistical analysis, right, in Syria. As the upheaval has increased, right, the Assad regime, he's still in there. And by one estimate, fully 25% of all children under age 5 have stunted growth. Their growth progression is impaired, a lack of access to adequate nutrition. So again, we look at gross national income in correlation to the fertility rate infant mortality rate per 1,000 live births, and the percentage of undernourished. So again, statistical stratification in those that are more developed. Right? Obviously, the gross national income is going to be higher, fertility rate lower, infant mortality 5 births per 1,000 in countries like ours, and less than 5% of the population is malnourished. When we move up a little bit, right, we see the disparities become greater as we move down the chart. And what's really alarming is the infant mortality rate and the total fertility rate based upon infrastructure available. The infant mortality rate, as we as it's defined in our chapter, is the number of deaths of infants under age 1 per 1,000 live births per year. Okay, so the number of deaths of infants under age 1 per 1,000 live births per year. This figure gives some insight into the health status of the population and of women and children in particular, because infant mortality rates are lowest in states that offer access to safe antenatal care and sanitary childbirth facilities, as well as good nutrition during pregnancy. By contrast, the less developed countries had a rate of 44 per 1,000 live births, and at least developed countries posted a rate of 62 per 1,000 live births, right, as we see the data here. By specific countries, right, again, depends where you look on the world map. Right? So developed nations, obviously lower in all categories. Developing nations like Mexico, still, not bad for undernourished population. It increases to places like Yemen, 26.1, right? And the mortality rates in Niger, 60 per 1,000, right? So when you don't have prenatal care, when you don't have contraceptives available to the population, choice, resulting in overpopulation, the disparity of the economy being able to provide for a growing population that its infrastructure cannot meet. So again, in 2014, the most developed countries had an infant mortality rate of just 5 per 1,000, less developed 44 per 1,000, and the least developed 62 per 1,000. So we can clearly see that infant mortality, right, and total fertility, and again, putting that transparency of that world map over undernourishment, right, so we can see a little better, right? If you correlate the alphabet application to the pie chart, right, the developed regions are going to have the least number, and the sub-Saharan, Eastern Asia, Southeastern Asia, as we saw on the world map, the most significant. Right? And although, like, longitudinally looking at more modern data as opposed to historically in the past, we're still far behind bridging the disparity between developed and underdeveloped populations in the world. Food security, potable drinking water, some things that we take for granted in these countries, in in our country, right, are, again, another one we take for granted, infrastructure regarding sanitation, right, which then impacts infectious disease, the spread of infectious disease. Extreme violence regarding survival situations in many of these nation states. So things like, just access to infrastructure, like the majority of India's 1.3 billion inhabitants do not have access to private toilets or latrines. According to the Population Reference Bureau, just 60% of urban Indians and 24% of rural Indians were using improved sanitation facilities in 2011. While this measure focuses on hygienic separation of sewage from human contact rather than safety privacy, it points to the presence of the lack of infrastructure in these nation states. The same report quotes local Indian police officials' estimate that more than 60% of the rapes occur in similar circumstances, just out of survival. Approximately 30% of the women from underprivileged sections of Indian society experience violent sexual assaults, violent sexual assaults. More than 60% of rapes occur in similar sections. Approximately 30% of Indian women from underprivileged sections of Indian society experience violent sexual assaults every year because just of the lack of sanitation facilities, having to go long distances into isolated rural areas, just for basic hygiene. So again, the emphasis here on improving simplistic infrastructure issues that we would consider in the United States become a major undertaking in these less developed nations. Figure on access vary from a full 100% in most developed countries to just 59% in Gambia, 32% in Afghanistan, 12% in Chad. And that's just access to sanitation facilities. Right? One of the most important variables of disparity, of inequality, is education. Right? Like we said, the improvement, and again, the feminization of poverty at a global level, right, emphasizes the disparities that women face globally. UNESCO, another arm of the United Nations, emphasizes economic and social outcomes, estimates at the global level on the global level, a year of school can be equal to a 10% boost in income, right, which is pretty significant. So education, right, as a role, like we saw regarding correlation in the short video regarding child mortality rates becoming less in women who achieve education. Right? Even today, an estimated 115 million young people around the globe, ages 15 to 24, are unable to read or write a sentence. So literacy, right, is another measurable indicator. Being just able to read and write. A study on Nigeria found that better reading skills among mothers were linked to lower rates of child mortality. Other work suggests that greater maternal education translates into a greater probability that women's children will be educated. So it's intergenerational as well as the immediate population. again, we look at the ability to read and write, right? The highest literacy rates, world population. Again, a longitudinal study comparing 2015 and 1990. So we see at least some increase, right, in these areas around the world, some more so. Right? We see not too bad a disparity in Latin America, East Asia, and the Pacific, in bridging the gap. And again, the emphasis on adult literacy. And again, the emphasis on culture and certain traditions in these less developed states, campaigning for a law setting 18 is the minimum age for marriage and for girls to remain in school. Right? In many populations of the world, when a woman reaches childbearing age, right, there's no age restrictions, no legal restrictions of impregnating such young girls, right? And as the book emphasizes, some of the most underdeveloped nations utilize human resources as an economic benefit. So if you're a family surviving on agriculture, right, the more children you have, the more labor, resulting in a greater product outcome, right? But limitations in advancement generationally for those children that assume those roles in agriculturally rich developed countries. So Yemen is a Middle East poorest country. The per capita gross national income is just $3,820 a year. The spread of armed conflict have deprived many families who had little to begin with of their homes and possessions. In this situation, some families are seeking to acquire resources and pay debts, as well as reduce family expenses. The war in Iraq, where we had a military presence, or in the Middle East, right? And the military infrastructure that we possess when we go in and bomb the countryside, right? For military outcomes. At the same time that we're doing it for military strength and protection of certain percentages of the population, we're also destroying the limited possessions the populations own in the capacity of destruction, right? Military destruction. So here's a map that looks at the percent of refugees, and we think that it's significant in our country, in our, area of the world, right? It's even more significant here, right, where people are fleeing situations like we just expressed or exemplified, right, regarding refugees, migrant and immigrant populations, leaving some of the poorest of the poor areas, right, in population figures, right? We have a major upheaval here, right? The Turks and Syria, and this area, Pakistan, right? Over 1 million refugees from this area to over 500,000. So, as much as we like to think that certain infrastructure situations will have an impact, such as building walls or structures that limit the population's migratory movement, it's not, no physical barrier is going to stop the population regarding the disparity that exists, right? In this part of the world, and I predict in this part of the world, right? And even though immigration is in our part of the world is is at some of the lowest figures now, right? Think about the populations we have in waiting, the economic responsibility you and I as taxpayers have assumed with this immigrant policy of separating parents and children, right? Now we have these institutional holding areas where children have been for years now, right? And as taxpayers, we have to pay the bills, right? Regarding the policy that's created by our governments, right? Globally, right? As we talk about trade and the global economy, right? Again, some of in this section, right? If you read these, the disparity here is enormous, right? In regards to population movement around the world. For instance, the country of Chad is home to an estimated 360,000 refugees from the Sudan, many of whom have been in the country for over a decade. And this movement is from one poor area of the country, of the world, to another, where both Sudan and Chad don't have the economic foundation, the economic resources to meet the demands. One of the things that the book emphasizes that's bridging the gap is technology, especially just the fact that people now have flip phones and can communicate, you know, in different parts of the world, where historically, even 5 to 10 years ago, the number of those limited technological advancements didn't exist, right? So when you look at the percentage of internet users in these poor areas of the world, right, technology is almost non-existent. And you know, and the capital, the economics to have a tool, a device that we almost all have in each household in the United States doesn't exist for the majority of the world. So this digital divide, this internet technological divide, right, is another major impact on stratification regarding technological advancement in the world. Here's an interesting example. Just another infrastructure, the number of libraries per population ratio in the United Kingdom and Nigeria. How many people utilize one library, right? As opposed to Great Britain. Here's the discussion, right? Can mobile phone technology contribute to bringing greater prosperity and equality of the planet? How might mass adoption of mobile homes contribute to addressing some of the inequalities, right? So that article in the chapter addresses wealth and poverty on the road. So lastly, to end the day, right, we have a question on the exam that asks you to address the 3 major theoretical applications in the book. And the first one was more of a functional structure. Modernization theory is a market-oriented development theory associated with the work of Walter Rostow, who was an economist in the early 60s. Worked for President John F. Kennedy as an economist. And you know, he used the metaphor or analogy of an airplane taking flight to illustrate his key ideas about stages of development. If you read this chapter, it helps you better understand the application of modernization theory. Right? So modernization theory, again, is a market-oriented development theory. And when you take off in the airplane, you're leaving in the traditional stage, pre-science, right? Pre-industrialization, pre-urbanization. Embracing tradition over innovation, economic development is limited by low rates of savings and investment and by work orientation that elevates subsistence over ambition and prosperity. The airplane is grounded and has not yet begun its journey to affluence. Right? And we find these underdeveloped nations still in a traditional stage, right? Still trying to get to the takeoff stage, where many developing nations are, right, ready to launch a transition in their society. Societies are moving from traditional cultural norms, practices, and institutions, and embracing economic development with a sense of purpose. This economist, Rostow, an originator of modernization theory, was an advisor to Kennedy, who came up with social organizations like the Peace Corps. What's another one? UNICEF, right? The United Nations oversees UNICEF, the Peace Corps, sending individuals from our nation who have educational expertise, some technological expertise, to help economic advancement in these geographical areas of the country. And the Peace Corps began in the 1960s. It's still an institution that exists across the globe. Right? The Peace Corps, which has for decades sent U.S. workers abroad to spread innovations, agriculturally, technologically, right, to help with this process of advancing toward modernity, right, from traditional cultural values. Industrialization, mass consumption, high living standards. Right? We look at populations even in the United States, right? I can immediately think of American Indians who many times, based upon traditional beliefs, right, limited economic advancement until the country and multinational corporations approached Indian tribes back in the 40s, 50s, because of the abundance of natural resources that existed under their lands, right? And through this process of natural resource development, created the transition toward a wage-earning economy, just like factories in cities like England, Paris, other major cities in Western Europe, right, when the takeoff stage during the Industrial Revolution materialized. Right? So once you reach, the flight reaches modernity, right, then the impact of social change emphasizes by Rostow, right? Technological progress, cultural modernity, buying power, economic advancement, industrialization, high consumption, mass living standards is the goal of modernization, right? Through these stage processes, right, progress may take the form of industrialization, which drives greater urbanization as rural dwellers leave poor agricultural areas seeking greater levels of opportunity in employment, in education. And again, in the United States, I go back to the example of American Indians that we discuss in American Indian Studies from time to time, because traditionally, up until about the 1970s, 1980s, a majority of Native people lived in rural environments. But as this economic acceleration toward development has increased, levels of education have increased, and impoverished conditions remain in impoverished areas like Indian reservations or inner city ghettos, right? People are starting to take flight from those populations, right? So that the 2010 census told us that 60% of Native Americans in the United States lived in cities, right? If we went back to 1970, that would have been reversed. 60% would have lived on rural environments, on reservations. Now, 2020, I predict, is going to have a greater level of Native Americans living in cities because of employment and educational opportunities. Dependency theory is more conflict, which argues the poverty of some countries is accomplished by the consequence of exploitation by wealthy states which control the global capitalist system. So we've used this example from the first week, Marxism, right? Global economic exploitation, multinational corporations moving to underdeveloped areas of the world to maximize profits and exploit labor, right? Which has led to this disparity that we have globally regarding developed, underdeveloped, and developing nations. So again, dependency, right, leads to economic exploitation, perfect conflict theory, right, that we've talked about, right, the multinational corporations. Meanwhile, in host countries like ours, right, it can impact unemployment rates, it can impact a trained labor force, right, that no longer can utilize this expertise in particular fields. World systems theory here, one of the, Emanuel Wallerstein, if you've had an economics class, you've probably heard of these guys, Rostow, Wallerstein. One of the pioneers of the theory argues that global capitalist economic system has long been shaped by few powerful economic actors who have constructed it in a way that favors their class interests, right? So you have a lot of resources located in these underdeveloped nations that are prone toward economic exploitation, right? Multinational corporations, right? There's a significant, we always look at the Middle East as a significant area for oil development,